Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Hello and welcome to Ilanomics. Today we're going to talk about anti-poverty programs of the government. In recent years, the definition of poverty has changed away from just calories and monetary values to other aspects of basic needs of individuals. So the recent report that was released on multidimensional poverty all over the world has three measures of poverty. These three include health, education, and standard of living. When we look at the report for India, what it shows is that in the period 1998 to 2004, there was a reduction in poverty, but that did not affect the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor were not lifted out of poverty in those years. So perhaps that had some indication and some lessons for the NDA-1 government, which had run the India Shining program. And perhaps that is one reason why, one of the elements, why they moved away from the India Shining sort of slogan, changed their strategy, and under Modi 1.0, we find a far greater emphasis on Antodaya. Antodaya is reaching the last man in the line, or reaching the poorest of the poor. Now, in the UPA years, when there was an improvement in the global poverty index, the emphasis of the UPA was on health and education. Health and education are actually very difficult to improve because they require institutional changes. There are lots of vested interests that fight against these institutional changes. And though there has been some improvement and many measures have been put in place, but the large-scale effect that health and improvement can have is slow and limited. The emphasis of the Modi 1.0 government was on the third measure, which is standard of living. Now, in 2014, India had, according to this global multidimensional poverty report, India had 34 crore poor people. These 34 crore poor people were poor on these various measures, including the standard of living measure. Now, what does that include? The standard of living measure includes cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing, whether you have a kacha or pakka house, and household assets. So let's start with the first one. The first, which is that a poor household is one that cooks with dung, with with agricultural crops, shrubs, coal, charcoal, or wood. Now, that's one thing we see clearly being addressed in the Ujjwala scheme. The Ujjwala scheme, the website for the Ujjwala scheme shows that LPG gas cylinders to poor families were given to the extent of 7.4 crore LPG gas cylinders. Now, many people have claimed that anecdotal evidence as well as some studies show that nearly half these cylinders were not replaced. So you only got the gas connection, you got the first cylinder, but the family did not have the money to buy the second cylinder, even though it was subsidized. And on that basis, people say that, look, the scheme was a failure. Perhaps that's true, but it's also true that if even half the people did benefit, did go on to buy the second cylinder, then the numbers tell us that, let's say, out of the 7.4 crore, 3.6 crore families benefited. Now, assuming a family size of 5, this tells us that about 17 crore families did benefit from this program and went on to buy their second cylinders. I'm just giving, back of the envelope calculations for the number of individuals who might have benefited. These might be a bit less or a bit more, but just a ballpark figure, maybe about 17 or 15 crore families at least would have benefited. Another 15 to 17 crore individuals would be those who will benefit when they can have the ability to buy the second cylinder. In other words, the point we're making here is that the standard of living, as measured by one of the indicators, that is cooking fuel and what was used, will likely show an improvement in the last 5 years. And the number of people who were poor would have come down. And that's not the only scheme. The Swachh Bharat mission, because sanitation and access to toilets is another measure of standard of living of people. This also was something that was directly addressed by the Modi government in the first term. 9.7 crore toilets were built in rural areas under the Swachh Bharat Gramin mission, and 58 lakh in urban areas. Now let's look at how this translates into affecting people who were poor. The criticism that is made of the toilet building scheme is that at least 40% of toilets did not have piped water and were not used. Sometimes there were issues of habit. We've heard about the nudge literature that talks about how behavioral changes are required and those need to be made. We've also heard about how solid waste management mechanisms have been lacking, and that is why at least 40% people have not been able to use those toilets. But the glass is not just half empty, the glass is also half full. So if you think about the remaining 60% who did use those toilets and the number of families who would have got affected, again, that affected their poverty levels and their standards of living. Now, similarly, I can give you examples from the Awas Yojana. Housing, as I said in the beginning, is one of the things that directly feeds into the measure of poverty, into the measure of multidimensional poverty, where if you live in a kacha house versus a pakka house, then the kacha house with a thatched roof is when you're counted as poor. So the Indira Awas Yojana reached out to in the Gramin Yojana, 1.5 crore houses were constructed, roughly 1.5 crore houses were constructed. And if we think about the number of individuals that would have been affected, then easily 6 to 7 crore individuals would have been affected. Now, all these people who have benefited, even if the schemes are incomplete, even if there are broken systems along the way, but the number of people who have been directly reached out to by the government and followed up with a lot of programs that the BJP did in terms of reaching out to the beneficiaries of the Pradhan Mantri programs and these various PM this and that schemes, which would have got something either into their Jan Dhan accounts or reached out to them, would have helped them connect to the last man, to the poorest of the poor. What we can expect, therefore, looking forward is, of course, one thing that we can expect is that when the next global poverty, global multi-dimensional poverty report comes out, then we can expect that would show a much bigger decline in poverty in these 5 years than the comparable 5 years of the NDA government, or even perhaps the comparable 10 years of the UPA government, because this time there was an attempt at directly hitting the exact indicators which are used in that measure. But that's one part of the story. The second, I think very important part of the story is of what we will see in terms of what this government might focus on next. And, you've already heard the Prime Minister talk about focusing on the Nal Se Jal scheme and the Jal Shakti scheme, where the government has vowed to give piped water to every household. Now you think about the millions of households today which will be directly getting something from the Prime Minister, thankful to the party, at least aware that this PM and the party is doing something. So one would expect that in preparation for the next election and in trying to reach out to the voters who are perhaps in the remotest part, who might have been left out by any of the other schemes, and where there is obviously a continued emphasis on reaching out to them and wooing the voters, would be a scheme like the Nal Se Jal scheme, which reaches directly to them, which reaches into their homes, and the whole family then sees benefit. So in conclusion, what I would say is that while it's looked like the government is carrying many of the UPA schemes forward, is as welfareist as the UPA government in terms of, in fact, even expanding the number of schemes that it came up with, expanding the beneficiaries, it also managed to reach to the beneficiaries far more effectively. So, through the programs that it ran and through the almost audit system that the party was then reaching out to those people, it did manage to have an effect on poverty levels far more effectively than maybe the previous government. Levels of corruption were brought down. That's what anecdotal evidence suggests. So, instead of just looking at what was missed out and, the lack of distribution for LPG or the lack of piped water for the toilets, those are some things that I think will happen in the next 5 years as the before the next general election, so that the party is going to be able to reach out directly to these beneficiaries and say that we've done something for the poorest. And I think that the numbers in the next global multidimensional poverty report will, because of these direct interventions, be smaller for the number of people who are poor in India, because there will be an improvement in these other measures that we are likely to see. Thank you. This is Elanomics. Please come back next week to watch the next episode of Elanomics. Thank you.